Heroes of Israel by William Garden Blaikie. Part 1. Abraham and Isaac. Chapter 1. Early Life of Abraham. Abraham is by far the most commanding figure in history from Adam to Moses. His life was so quiet and so simple that it is only when we think carefully what he was and what he did that we apprehend his true greatness. God chose him to be the father of a great nation and the founder of a great religion, two very lofty functions in connection with his great scheme for the redemption of the human race. When all the world was rushing after idols and worshipping other gods, the majestic figure of Abraham stood apart. One God alone existed in all the universe for him, and his life was spent in such communion with him as to show what nobility and blessedness that fellowship brings. It was to his seed that all future revelations and communications from God were to be made, until at last there should arise that seed of the woman who was to bruise the head of the serpent, and in whom, as it was more explicitly put to him, quote, all the families of the earth were to be blessed, end quote. All this was connected with a new page of history which God had just turned over. Men had been showing such disregard of the divine light and such love of darkness that, leaving the world to its cherished ways, God had resolved to concentrate the light on a single family and a single race, and thus preserve the truth till the world should become ripe for a fuller revelation. Abraham was the man chosen to receive this light and found this race. It seems as if we might hear him saluted, as was one of his descendants afterwards, quote, Hail, thou that art highly favoured among men, end quote. Of such a man, every scrap of biography is of profoundest interest. The biography of a great man usually begins with his family. It is not mere curiosity that desires to know from what sort of people he sprang, for if his forefathers were in any way remarkable, it is useful to see how they influenced their son. Even in the case of Jesus himself, it is significant, from the human point of view, that he was the son of Mary and the son of David. But in the case of Abraham, such inquiries come to very little. Of his forefathers, we know hardly more than the names. Even of Shem, the son of Noah, we know nothing but that, like his brother Japheth, he was a more dutiful son than Ham. Ex ungue leomum fails us here. We cannot construct the lion from his claw. We must believe that Abraham's fathers followed the mode of life that we know to have been common in the Semitic race, and that in the main they were as such men generally have been. They were stock farmers, perhaps we should now say ranchmen, and that on a large scale. Terah, Abraham's father, appears to have been a farmer. His 3 sons certainly were. Of his mother, neither scripture nor tradition gives the faintest hint, although to her he may have owed some of his most notable features both of body and mind. As women were not placed in the genealogical records, so they were little considered as influencing the family history. Haran, one of Terah's sons, perhaps the eldest, died before his father, but the possessions of his son Lot in flocks and herds seem to have been not much, if at all, inferior to those of Abraham. Genesis chapter 13, verse 7. Nahor, Abraham's other brother, likewise became the head of a great establishment of flocks and herds. Genesis chapter 14. Abraham himself was equally prosperous, and at least equally rich in this wealth of the time. The fact of interest here is that, unlike other great religious leaders, Abraham was a layman, and engaged very fully during his whole active life in business pursuits. It seems to have been God's purpose to show through him not only that honest secular business does not disqualify for high service and divine communion, but that it may be followed even by those chosen servants of God who, as great religious reformers, confer the highest blessings on the world. But Abraham's early life must have been moulded by influences far above those of his earthly calling. However useful and honourable the life of a stock farmer may be, it is not very elevating. The thoughts do not rise very high when they are much with cattle, nor is it an advantage when all the family are of the same calling. When the pursuits of one are different from those of the others, new ideas and associations are thrown into the circle, and there is some chance of the freshness that is bred of variety. But when all are working among cattle, thinking of cattle, talking of cattle, a bucolic dullness and low level of life are apt to ensue. Influences from other quarters are needed, from religion, from education, from public life, to prevent the character from becoming stunted and the life wasted. It must have been some of these influences, working too with extraordinary intensity, that raised Abraham so high above the common level, and turned the Chaldean farmer into a great hero to be honored to the end of time. The chronology of Abraham's life is not very clear. If we add up the intervals between father and son as given in Genesis chapter 11, verses 10 to 26 in, quote, the generations of Shem, end quote, the whole period from the flood to the birth of Terah's eldest son is only 292 years. If we consider that Shem lived after the flood 500 years, this reckoning would make his life extend over the greater part of Abraham's, even supposing Abraham to have been a younger son of Terah, and born long after his eldest brother. So Milton seems to have thought, when Michael expresses his wonder that men should have been idolatrous while, quote, the patriarch lived that scaped the flood, end quote. But we can hardly conceive the interval so short as this. We are thrown back on the chronology of the Septuagint, which adds 100 years to the life of each of 5 patriarchs before the birth of their eldest sons. Also adds 50 years to the life of Nahor, in one version 150, and interposes a Cainan between Arphaxad and Salah, making at this point a difference of 130 years. The whole period between the flood and the call of Abraham would thus be extended to 1147 or 1247 years. The tendency of modern opinion is strongly in the direction of the longer chronology, in favor of which it is urged that according to the Hebrew method of noting numbers, mistakes in transcription might occur very readily, and that the Septuagint followed much older Hebrew manuscripts than any that are extant now. Moreover, the memorials of transactions of great magnitude and stretching over long periods, which have come down to us in the recently deciphered monuments of Egypt and Assyria, create a strong feeling in favor of the more extended period. The birth of Abraham has been placed approximately by some recent writers at BC 2150. We get into a region of more promise and productiveness when we inquire as to Abraham's native country and native city. The country was Chaldea, and the city with which his family was connected was, quote, Ur of the Chaldees, end quote. Next to Egypt, if not on a level with it, Chaldea was the most interesting, the most remarkable, and the most civilized country of those distant times. The two countries were alike in this, that both were reclaimed from the desert, not indeed by the hand of man, but by an agency of nature's own. From near the west coast of Africa to near the east coast of Asia, there stretches a gigantic wilderness, the western part mostly of level sand, the eastern of barren mountains. It is a strip of the African desert that has been turned into a garden by the River Nile, the overflow of whose waters has been at once the cause and the symbol of fertility and abundance from the earliest ages of human history. A portion of the Asiatic desert has in like manner been fertilized by the two great rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Both are streams of imperial rank, having their origin in snow-clad mountains, from which they have carried down into the plain of Chaldea a mass of alluvial soil that makes it one of the richest countries in the world. It is nearly agreed among geographers, ancient and modern, that the name Chaldea is not given to the whole of the plain watered by the two rivers, but only to the lower part of it, the part formed by the deposits. Part of this is also called in Scripture the land of Shinar, Genesis chapter 11, verse 2. In this restricted sense, Chaldea was a small country, of only about 23,000 square miles. It was rather larger than Greece, less than Scotland, about equal to Holland, which in some respects it resembled, and almost exactly the same size as Denmark. It was not in consequence of its size, therefore, that it became a great country, but for causes similar to those which have given to Egypt, Palestine, Phoenicia, Greece, Venice, Holland, and Scotland their remarkable place in the history of the globe. On the west, Chaldea was bounded by the Arabian desert, consisting, in its first reach, of sand and gravel, and further west becoming more stony, a region where no settled population can at any time have found a subsistence, and where the occasional inhabitants are subject to sandstorms and to the destructive simoom, whose deadly blast, sweeping across the entire tract, proves fatal alike to man and beast. On the northwest of Chaldea lay Mesopotamia, which on its northern and northeastern boundary touched Assyria. The plain of Assyria embraced the country between the Tigris and Media, and differed from that of Chaldea in being less flat and of higher elevation. To the southeast of Chaldea was the country known to the Jews as Elam, and to the Greeks as Susis or Susiana. Chaldea at its southern corner touched the sea. This was one of the causes of its early preeminence, for, excepting Elam, the countries adjacent to it enjoyed no such advantage. The Indian Ocean invited to commerce, and gave easy communication with India, Arabia, Egypt, and Ethiopia. The trade of Chaldea with other countries not only enlarged its resources, but quickened the energies and stimulated the intellect of its people. It was not among a sluggish race that Abraham was born, but one that knew how to use the advantages that nature had given them and enrich their life by the material products and mental attainments of other lands. The city in or near which Abraham was born was called Ur, quote, Ur of the Chaldees, end quote, to distinguish it probably from other Urs, of which there seem to have been several. For many ages, tradition assigned his birthplace to a town now called Urfa, or Orpha, known also in classical history as Edessa, the capital of the kingdom of that king Agabus, who is said in an old but unauthentic tradition to have received a letter from our Lord, along with his portrait. Some authorities still hold by Orpha, and Dean Stanley, in his, quote, Lectures on the Jewish Church, end quote, has given it the high sanction of his name. But it seems a fatal objection to Orpha that it was situated not in what was known as Chaldea proper, but in what was afterwards known by the Hebrews as Aram Naharaim, Syria of the two rivers, or Padan Aram, the plain of Syria, and by the Greeks as Mesopotamia. Besides, Orpha is but some 20 miles from Haran, and the removal of Abraham, with his father and nephew, from Ur to Haran, would not have had the importance which it bears if the two places had been so near. In quite recent years it has been discovered from inscriptions on disinterred cylinders that a town now called Mugaya, or Mugia, near the right bank of the Euphrates, was formerly called Ur, or Hur, and was in all probability, quote, Ur of the Chaldees, end quote. It was in many ways a notable place. Its history, as recently brought to light from the monuments, carries us far back, and indicates a progress reached at that time in many of the arts of civilized life for which we were not prepared. From these monuments it appears that the Chaldean plain was in early times possessed by a people known as the Akkadians, who seem to have come down from an earlier settlement among the hills, and founded two kingdoms, a northern and a southern, the capital cities of which were Akkad and Ur respectively. The language of this people was of the Turanian family. They were probably not of Semitic but of Cushite origin, and their civilization appears to have been of a high order, and their literature extensive and varied. The towns Akkad and Ur contained large libraries, with as many as 10,000 volumes, carefully arranged and numbered, and there are still found among the ruins remains of clay tickets, with the names and numbers of the books which readers desired to get from the librarian. Many of these tickets appear to have been written while the Akkadian was yet a spoken language, probably before the time of Abraham. It is held by most British scholars, but not by all those of the continent, that the Akkadian civilization was the parent of the Chaldean. After being settled in the Chaldean plains, the Akkadians appear to have been attacked and conquered by a people from Elam of Semitic origin, who adopted the civilization of the conquered race, their religion, art, literature, customs of various kinds, everything except their language. This conquest is believed to have taken place considerably before the time of Abraham. Abraham's family was Semitic, and would seem to have been long settled in Ur of the Chaldees before he was called to leave it. The new conquerors appeared to have been active and aggressive, extending the confines of their empire wherever they had a chance. In Abraham's time, a body of confederate kings from Elam, Shinar, and other places in the neighborhood invaded the country round Sodom and Gomorrah, and carried off his nephew Lot, but were pursued and defeated by him. Some of this aggressive army, though probably not all, were of Abraham's own race, and they would not have been attacked by him but for the necessity of rescuing one who was still nearer to him than they. It is an interesting fact, which the Assyrian monuments have brought to light, that the Akkadian people who played so important a part in the early history of Chaldea were of Turanian or Cushite origin. This agrees with what used to be a perplexing statement of Scripture, that Cush begat Nimrod, quote, the beginning of whose kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar, end quote. Besides the Cushites and Semites thus accounted for, there seem to have been two other nationalities among the early Chaldeans, for we find the early kings constantly designated in the inscription as Kiprat Arbat, quote, the four nations, end quote, or Arba listen, quote, the four tongues, end quote. Quote, it would result from this review of the linguistic facts and other ethnic indications, end quote, says Canon Rawlinson, quote, that the Chaldeans were not a pure but a very mixed people. Like the Romans in ancient and the English in modern Europe, they were a colluvio gentium omnium, a union of various races between which there was marked and violent contrast. It is now generally admitted that such races are among those which play the most distinguished part in the world's history, and most vitally affect its progress, end quote. Among such races, therefore, we are to class the Hebrew. Though is now situated 5 or 6 miles back from the Euphrates, and 125 miles from the Persian Gulf, it was formerly on the banks of the river, and not far from the sea, for the soil borne down by the river has encroached so continually on the sea that places formerly seaports are now considerably inland. In former times it was practically the seaport of Babylon. The inscriptions constantly speak of the ships of and of the brisk commerce carried on by its inhabitants. The ruins of cover an oval space, 1,000 yards long by 800 broad, and consist mostly of low mounds. Near the northern end are still to be seen the remains of a remarkable building. Quote, it is a temple of the true Chaldean type, built in stages, of which 2 remain, and composed of brick, partly sunburnt and partly baked, laid chiefly in a cement of bitumen, end quote. It was dedicated to the moon god, Herki, from whom the town itself seems to have derived its name. Quote, retained its metropolitan character for above 2 centuries, and even after it became second to Babylon, was a great city with an especially sacred character. The notions entertained of its superior sanctity led to its being used as a cemetery city, not only during the time of the early Chaldean supremacy, but throughout the Assyrian and the later Babylonian period. It is in the main a city of tombs, end quote. Neither the remains of this temple nor any other remains of the early period indicate much taste in architecture. The edifices were more solid than beautiful. There being no stone in the whole plain, the only building material was brick, formed of the clay which abounded in the alluvium, and the bricks were either kiln-burned or sun-dried, the burnt material being much more solid and durable than the other. The better class of dwelling houses were built of this material, but the mass of the people had to content themselves with humbler dwellings. The reeds, which in the marshes grow to a height of even 12 or 14 feet, might be easily formed into walls or bent into arches, and covered with mats of flags or sedge. Such houses might be made to last for half a lifetime. If palms were substituted for reeds, and wattles plastered with mud for rush mats, the house would be stronger and snugger. In such a house, very probably Abraham was born and bred, and if such was the home of his youth, it might prepare him for his afterlife, when he had nothing better for a dwelling than a movable tent. The temple to the moon goddess was the great building of It was conspicuous from all parts of the city, and like the temple of Diana at Ephesus in an after age, it indicated the enthusiasm with which the goddess was worshipped, in whose honour it was reared. It is believed to have been the work of 2 kings, Rebutsiru and his son Dungi. In the reign of the latter, it is probable that Abraham was born. It could not have been easy for Abraham to break away from a worship signalled by so magnificent a temple, and supported by the authority and enthusiasm of 2 successive kings, who were probably as intolerant of dissenters from the national worship as Nebuchadnezzar in the same plains 1,500 years after. The religion of the Chaldean people was eminently polytheistic. Our greatest experts have found it difficult to give a connected and consistent account of it. We follow the description of Callan Rawlinson. The chief god was Il, or Ra, of whom we hear little. Next came three, Anna, Bel, or Belus, and Hea, or Hoa, corresponding to Pluto, Jupiter, and Neptune. Each of these had a wife, Anat, Melita, and Davkina. Then followed a further triad, Sin, or Herki, the moon god, San, or Sansi, the sun, and Vul, the god of the atmosphere. Each of these likewise had a wife. Then came 5 deities representing the 5 planets, Nip, or Ninip, Saturn, Merodach, Jupiter, Nergal, Mars, Ishtar, Venus, and Nebo, Mercury. These constituted the principal gods. After them came inferior deities, almost without number. Of the appearance under which these gods were conceived, the Assyrian monuments furnish us with striking representations. Nin, the fish god, is represented by a figure whose back consists of a large scaly fish, the mouth of the fish being the crown of the head. The man-bull, so familiar to us in the Nineveh remains, is another emblem of Nin. The man-lion, with his vast wings, is the emblem of Nergal, the Mars or god of war of the Chaldeans. Doubtless Abraham was familiar with these figures. He would constantly see them receiving the homage of his countrymen, and in his youth, before he was enlightened from above, he may have bowed the knee to them himself, as his fathers had done before him. It is not easy to distinguish the popular religion of the Chaldeans from the theory of religion that may have been entertained by the priests or wise men of the nation. It may be that at first these deities were merely set forth as poetical symbols of the powers of nature, nor was the recognition of them incompatible with a theoretical belief in a supreme God. But if they originally stood for the powers of nature, it is certain that they soon came to be looked on as personal beings. And whatever may have been the sentiments of the more learned or thoughtful of the people, the Chaldean religion came practically to be very degraded. Charms and spells were used to cure or ward off diseases, the arts of sorcery for bewitching and exorcising, and omens and other appliances of divination for discovering the unknown. A sensual element, too, was blended with the worship, and wherever this occurred, its tendency was not to elevate, but to degrade the worshippers. But if the popular religion of Chaldea was thus corrupt and unsatisfactory, the legends of the past which probably prevailed in Abraham's time came much nearer to the truth, and carried the mind much more definitely to one supreme God. It is from certain fragments of Berosus, a historian of Chaldea who flourished between 200 and 300 years before Christ, that we get our knowledge of the Chaldean cosmogony and early history of the race. Under a fantastic garb, which was probably regarded as symbolical, it delineated a process of creation not unlike what we have in the first chapter of Genesis. In the beginning, all was chaos and water, in which living creatures and monstrous forms disported themselves, ruled over by a woman named Omorka, in Chaldee Thalath, in Greek Thalassa, the sea. Belus appeared and split the woman in two. Of one half he made the heaven, of the other the earth. The heaven and earth were thus divided, and the animals formerly existing perished. Belus then commanded one of the gods to cut off his head and mingle his blood with the earth. From this mixture animals sprang up, and man, a partaker of divine wisdom. Belus then made the stars, the sun, and the moon, and the 5 planets. The legends of the flood and of the Tower of Babel are of similar tenor, with a substantial resemblance to the narrative of Genesis, but with circumstantial variations. According to Berosus, some portions of the ark remained in his time in Armenia, in the Gordian Kurdish mountains, and persons scraped off the bitumen from it to bring away, and used it as a remedy to prevent misfortunes. Of the Tower of Babel he says, quote, "The earth was still of one language when the primitive men, who were proud of their strength and stature, and despised the gods as their inferiors, erected a tower of vast height, in order that they might mount to heaven. And the tower was now near to heaven, when the gods, or God, caused the winds to blow, and overturned the structure upon the men, and made them speak with diverse tongues. Wherefore the city was called Babel." End quote. The Chaldean inscriptions recently deciphered in Assyria give a fuller account of the creation and of the flood than that of Berosus. We see clear traces of a prevalent polytheism, to which the narrative has been adapted. Generally, these narratives are marked by a tendency to wordy embellishment. They are a contrast to the severe simplicity of the narrative of the Bible, which furnishes evidence of truth. One of the most important additions to our knowledge of Chaldean traditions which the Assyrian monuments have given us relates to the Sabbath. It appears that, quote, the month was divided into 2 halves of 15 days each, these being further subdivided into 3 periods of 5 days. But a week of 7 days was also in use from the earliest ages. The days of the week were named after the sun, moon, and 5 planets, and our own weekdays may be traced back to the active brains of the long-forgotten people of Chaldea, the Akkadians. The 7th, 14th, 21st, and 28th days of the month were termed Sabbaths, or days of rest, when the king was forbidden to eat cooked fruit or meat, to change his clothes or wear white robes, to drive his chariot, to sit in judgment, to review his army, or even to take medicine should he feel unwell. End quote. 2 lines of one of the Assyrian tablets are thus rendered by Mr. Talbot, an eminent Oriental archaeologist. Quote, on the 7th day he appointed a holy day, and to cease from all business he commanded. End quote. This author adds that, quote, it has been known for some time that the Babylonians observed the Sabbath with considerable strictness. End quote. Abraham could have had no cause to reject the Sabbath as an idolatrous invention. It came down from the creation as a divine institution, and we may well believe that the whole course of his life was marked by a careful and devout observance of the day of rest. The wide alluvial plain of Chaldea was deficient in elements of interest and variety, but it was of singular fertility. According to Herodotus, it was the most fruitful in grain of any part of the world, 200-fold being the common yield, and sometimes 300-fold. The graceful foliage of the date palm was the chief object that relieved the monotony of the plain. While the alluvial soil was so admirably adapted for grain crops, there were tracts also more fitted for pasture at a greater distance from the river. In one of these it is probable that the family of Abraham was settled. The name may have comprehended some such region adjacent to the city, where Abraham may very probably have spent the early part of his life. There is still a considerable amount of uncertainty about some parts of the history as derived from the monuments, but there seems no reason to doubt that the scene of Abraham's birth and early life was far more advanced in civilization than we have been accustomed to suppose. We have, indeed, no cause to think that Abraham, like Moses in Egypt, was learned in all the wisdom of the Chaldeans, but neither are we to think of him as ignorant and uneducated. We should not be doing him justice if we thought of him merely as an Arab sheikh, rejoicing in the exercise of his despotic power, and with an ever-greedy eye to the increase of his cattle. The heavenly bodies from the first attracted the special interest of the Chaldeans, and we may well believe that of Abraham among the rest. There is a tradition preserved by Josephus that when Abraham went to Egypt, he taught the Egyptians arithmetic and astronomy. It is probably an idle tale, but it is more than likely that he was in full possession of any knowledge that was then possessed of astronomical science, and that when God afterwards brought him forth abroad and said, quote, look now toward heaven, and tell the stars if thou be able to number them, end quote, Abraham gazed on objects with which he was quite familiar, and the number of which he had often tried in vain to count. But by far the most interesting and significant fact in Abraham's early life was that in the midst of universal polytheism and idolatry, he came to believe firmly in one God, and to worship him alone. It was not that his family had kept the primitive faith pure from the days of Noah, for Joshua says expressly, quote, your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old time, even Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods, end quote. Chapter 24, verse 2. In his very father's house, Abraham had been brought up in an atmosphere of polytheism and idolatry. Under the shadow of this fact, there must lie a history of struggle and final victory which might peradventure rival in thrilling interest all that we know of the struggles of Augustine, of Luther, or of Bunyan. The Bible does not enter on it, and the fragments of tradition bearing on it, preserved by Jewish, Arabian, and Christian writers, are neither very trustworthy nor interesting. In some way, and it could not but have been a most interesting way, Abraham must have made his escape from the meshes of his traditional faith and traditional worship and come out, probably alone and unbefriended, to the knowledge and worship of the one true God. That the revelation of the truth came to him supernaturally from God himself goes without saying, but whether by flashes of external revelation or by a gradual process of inward illumination and struggle, we are not told. We are prone to think that it was by sheer supernatural power that God lifted up men like Abraham to the lofty faith which they came to hold. But it is more in accordance with God's ordinary method to bring his children gradually into the light, and thus prepare them for the great decisive struggle through which they must pass. That the current notions of the existence of many gods were false, that there was but one God, supreme, infinite, and all-sufficient, may at first have come into Abraham's mind as a vague hint, a kind of dream flitting before him like a shadow. But once admitted in his mind, the thought could not be got rid of. The more he thought on the subject, the more he felt his own needs, the more scope he gave to his aspirations, the more he observed the unity of nature, the more he tried to grasp certain traditions of the past that had not yet quite melted away, so much the firmer hold would his new view take of him. At first it may have frightened him, for if it should prove true, and he should have to avow it publicly, he would become the object of universal condemnation. Every mouth would be opened against him. Was he alone right, and all the world wrong? Was the opinion of a young farmer to be set above the convictions of a learned and renowned priesthood that had presided for ages over the worship of the gods? Was the great temple of the moon, which had been constructed in Ur at such cost, to be discredited and dishonored because Abraham, the son of Terah, had come to believe that there was no such deity as the moon goddess? It is easy to conceive his mind agitated by a tremendous conflict and pressed by very grievous temptations. But whatever the preparatory process, it ended in the firm, God-given conviction that there was but one God, and that he only was to be worshipped. Quote, "Here I stand," end quote. We can conceive Abraham exclaiming like Luther afterwards, quote, "I cannot do otherwise. God help me," end quote. In this decision, the fortune of the whole world was involved. The clouds of polytheism and idolatry were closing over it on every side, and Abraham remained the only clear, firm, outstanding witness to the unity and spirituality of God. There were indeed men like Melchizedek holding the same faith, but they could not have grasped it with the firmness of Abraham, for then it would not have passed away. Abraham came to grasp it as the very treasure of his soul. His name stands high in that list of great men who have stood alone against all around them as discoverers of truth and benefactors of the world. On that choice of his, instrumentally, depended the preservation of the knowledge of the true God for long centuries, with all the moral and spiritual blessing, all the comfort and joy and hope, all the purifying and elevating influence on human life and character which are involved in the belief. By thus preserving the great fundamental truth of God's unity, he kept in its integrity the only foundation on which, 2,000 years after, the revelation of the gospel could be reared. Quote, "If," end quote, as Max Muller has remarked, quote, "From our earliest childhood we have looked upon Abraham, the friend of God, with love and veneration. His venerable figure will assume still more majestic proportions when we see in him the life-spring of that faith which was to unite all the nations of the earth, and the author of that blessing which was to come on all nations through Jesus Christ. And if we are asked how this one Abraham passed through the denial of all other gods to the knowledge of the one God, we are content to answer that it was by a special divine revelation, granted to that one man, and handed down by him to Jews, Christians, and Mohammedans, to all who believe in the God of Abraham. We want to know more of that man than we do, but even with the little we know of him, he stands before us as a figure second only to one in the whole history of the world." End quote. The impression we derive of the strength and greatness of Abraham's character from the position he thus assumed as the first great reformer of the religion of the world is very powerful, for, as Canon Mosley has remarked, quote, "A divine revelation does not dispense with a certain character and certain qualities of mind in the man who is the instrument of it. A man who throws off the chains of authority and association must be a man of extraordinary independence and strength of mind, although he does so from obedience to a divine revelation, because no miracle, no sign or wonder which accompanies a revelation can, by its simple stroke, force human nature from the innate hold of custom. and the adhesion to and fear of public opinion can enable it to confront the frowns of men and take up truth opposed to general prejudice, except there is in the man himself, who is the recipient of the revelation, a certain strength of mind and independence which concurs with the divine intention." End quote. It was impossible for Abraham, when he came to the clear perception of the truth, to keep it to himself. He must, at the very least, cease from taking part in idolatrous worship, and when asked his reason, acknowledge that he has ceased to believe in the gods. For in Chaldea the practice prevailed of recognizing a supreme being without renouncing the worship of the other deities. To this Abraham could not assent. A prayer to the god of Ur, recently deciphered from the monuments, may exemplify that theoretical recognition of the supreme being which admitted nevertheless of subordinate gods. Quote, "Lord and Prince of gods, who in heaven and earth alone is supreme, Father Nana, Lord of the firmament, Prince of the gods, merciful one, begetter of the universe, who founds his illustrious seat among living creatures, Father, long-suffering and full of forgiveness, whose hand upholds the life of all mankind. Lord, thy divinity, like the far-off heaven, fills the wide sea with fear. Father, begetter of gods and men, who causes the shrine to be founded, who establishes the offering. Firstborn, omnipotent, whose heart is immensity, and there is none who may discover it. Lord, the ordainer of the laws of heaven and earth, whose command may not be broken. Thou holdest the rain and the lightning, defender of all living things. There is no God who at any time hath discovered thy fullness. In heaven, who is supreme? Thou alone, thou art supreme. On earth, who is supreme? Thou alone, thou art supreme. As for thee, thy will is made known in heaven, and the angels bow their faces. As for thee, thy will is made known upon earth, and the spirits below kiss the ground. As for thee, thy will hath created law and justice, so that mankind has established law. King of kings, whose divinity no god resembleth, look with favour on thy temple, look with favour on thy city." End quote. To the supremacy of the one true and living God, and to the duty of rendering all worship to him, and in no way recognizing any other, it was the great distinction of Abraham's life that he was called to be a witness. But it was not as a preacher or propagandist that he was to bear this witness. He was to maintain it within his own family, destined to become a nation, and to protect it from all mixture with neighbouring idolatries. By preserving the truth pure at home, he was to make it efficacious abroad. As Dean Stanley has well said, quote, "It is rather as if he were possessed of the truth himself than as if he had any call to proclaim it to others. His life is his creed. His migration is his mission. But we can hardly doubt that here the legendary tales fill up, though in their own fantastic way, what the biblical account dimly implies. It may be an empty fable that Terah was a maker of idols, and that Abraham was cast by Nimrod into a burning fiery furnace for refusing to worship him. We may be forgiven if we supply the void by a well-known legend which has left its traces in almost every traditional account of the life of Abraham. The scene is sometimes laid in Ur, sometimes in the celebrated hill above Damascus. The story is best told in the words of the Quran. "When night overshadowed him, he saw a star, and said, 'This is my Lord.' But when it set, he said, 'I like not those that set.' And when he saw the moon rising, he said, 'This is my Lord.' But when the moon set, he answered, 'Verily, if my Lord direct me not in the right way, I shall be as one of those who err.' And when he saw the sun rising, he said, 'This is my Lord. This is greater than the star or moon.' But when the sun went down, he said, 'O my people, I am clear of these things. I turn my face to him who hath made the heaven and the earth." End quote. If Abraham's mission was not to be that of an active propagandist, for which the world was not ripe, but rather that of a personal witness to the sublime truth to which he had attained respecting God, it was not advisable that he should remain in a community so wedded to idolatry and polytheism as Ur. He must enjoy some protection from influences that would have been perpetually assailing him in his native place, and which, though they could not have prevailed against him personally, might have disturbed and corrupted his household, and impaired the testimony of their united practice. He must be transplanted to some place where he would be practically independent, and not subject to the authority of a great kingly and priestly power like that of Chaldean Ur, What his next move should be would doubtless have been very embarrassing if he had no one but himself to guide him. But the God whom he had come to know was now more than an abstraction to him. Already that fellowship had begun, which procured for him the title applied by St. James, chapter 2, verse 23, and universally bestowed on him at the present day in Mohammedan countries, El Khalil, or Khalil Allah, quote, the friend of God, end quote. Here is the index to another great but unknown chapter in the spiritual history of Abraham. To grasp intellectually the truth that there was a God, one living and true God, was one thing. To know him as a friend, and to be on terms of loving fellowship with him, was another. It would seem that in Abraham's case, the revelation of God's nature and the revelation of God as his friend and father were not far separated. In making himself known to him as the one God, God made himself known also as interested in his welfare, ready to forgive his sins, and to bless him with all spiritual as well as temporal blessings. And the faith of the patriarch enabled him to take in both those revelations. He had a receptive nature, disposed to accept what came to him on divine authority, and he reaped his reward. Even at this early period of his life, quote, he believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, end quote. He found in God a companion and a friend that raised him far above the level of common life, and made him consciously a citizen of a higher country. Of the play and movements of his inner life, we have hardly a note in Scripture, but if we knew all, we should probably find that his experience had many resemblances to that of his son David, one of the few Hebrews whose soul is thrown open to us, and whose varied moods of hope and fear, of trouble and of trust, are so often reflected and repeated in every age. Strangely swayed by the combined feeling of high dignity and deep humility, Abraham would go about among his neighbors manifesting a spirit which they could not explain. They could not know the difference between the cold, hard feeling of the worshipper of idols and the serene and joyous trust of one who was indeed and in truth the friend of God. This being his frame, he received a communication from him that left no doubt as to his future course. Ur of the Chaldees was to be his home no more.